This week in Agribusiness, serving America's most essential industry, with agriculture broadcaster Orion Samuelson and yours truly, Max Armstrong, and featuring agriculture meteorologist Greg Solier. This week in Agribusiness is brought to you by Firestone. You never farm alone.
Global leaders gathered in Glasgow, Scotland to discuss climate change, and agriculture had a seat at the table. Hello, folks. Welcome to This Week in Agribusiness. I'm Mike Pearson here in the studio this week. We'll hear from Max Armstrong a little bit later in the program. This time of year, a lot of farmers are watching the weather to make sure they can get their crops out in time. But a lot of global leaders gathered in Scotland to discuss not the weather, but the climate. We're joined this week by Ann Meese. She is the chairwoman of the U.S. Farmers and Ranchers in Action. She had a chance to be in Glasgow, Scotland. And Ann, thanks for taking the time to talk to us this week.
Glad to be here.
In agriculture, oftentimes we feel as though climate change activists view us as the problem. You had a chance to interact with over 30,000 people in Glasgow for this COP26 conference. Ann, what was your reception like as a farmer at this show?
Well, there's definitely a European influence there at the UN climate talks. And I will be perfectly honest with you that U.S. agriculture is often viewed as industrial ag, and there is strong forces out there that believe that animal agriculture is part of the problem. That's why organizations like USFRA, who want to bring that united voice of U.S. agriculture to conversations like this, are so important. Because what I saw there was that climate change conferences in the past was mainly focused on energy and a reduction of emissions. Well, that's certainly important, but there's this real shift in conversations and a focus on nature-based solutions. So these nature-based solutions have been focused also on forests and natural lands. But boy, isn't it time for the millions of farmers who steward the land and natural resources that we stand up and that we're heard and we use our voice to show that we are part of the solution for this climate change. And it's happening as we speak. These shifts are happening. And we know that we're the eco workforce. I just love that term, and I'm going to use it whenever I can. That not only have we been entrusted to provide food, but also leave this land better than we found it for the next generation. So we have to shift this focus toward land solutions, and who better than those of us who are closest to the soil need to be there and help steer this movement.
That is true. And in order to be heard, you've got to be in a room with the decision makers. And while you were in Glasgow, did you have the conversation to sit with any of the leaders in this space?
Well, leadership at USFRA has changed, and we have real leadership at USFRA that was knocking down doors 2 years before we attended this conference, working with people who are the decision makers and having Zoom meetings with everyone who was there. For example, we met with 3 global sustainability supply chains of 3 major global companies. Cargill, I sat down with their global supply, Nestle company, McDonald's Corporation. Those are the kind of connections that we've made in this organization, because those are the decision makers who are concerned about their supply chain, are getting their food from the farmers, and they want to get this right too. And they want to work with farmers and organizations like USFRA.
So, Ann, how can farmers who are interested in this, or even those who aren't, be a part of these solutions as these shifts happen in perception of environmental issues?
Absolutely. We certainly welcome the major commodities back to the table at USFRA. And what we've done is, through our work with through the value chain and supply chain, we've created a common vision for agriculture called the Decade of Ag. I encourage everyone to Google the Decade of Ag under USFRA website and join the movement where we can elevate agriculture as part of the solution.
These conversations are only getting started. It's great to have a seat at the table. Ann Meese from U.S. Farmers and Ranchers in Action. And now it's time to take a look at the markets. Brian Hoops, the president of Midwest Market Solutions, joins us. And Brian, earlier this week, USDA released their November supply and demand estimates. Caught some traders by surprise. Let's talk about what changed in the corn picture.
Yeah, Mike, this week the USDA increased corn yields just slightly, but it is a new all-time record. So that was a little bit bearish from the standpoint that trade was caught off guard by that. But with wheat prices moving higher after the report and soybeans on the report day itself, it helped the corn market to rally. So trade is, knows that we have production numbers that are record or near record large. And now we go into the January report looking for demand indicators to give us some direction, because we won't have any supply numbers until that January final report in the middle of the month. So we're looking at tight basis levels, slow farmer selling, tight farmer holding. Producers that we've talked with have really done a great job over the last several years of building on-farm storage facilities, and that is going to keep a lot of product off of the market. And so we're going to see tight basis levels as a result. And I think there's that's going to kind of lead the futures market higher. We've seen some pretty decent gains this week, despite the fact that we saw a production increase. The soybean market, we did not get that production increase that the trade was expecting, but it's still a very large number, one of the top 3 biggest yields in history. But again, for soybeans, that may be the weak link, because we do have expectations for a big South American crop. The demand is not quite as strong for soybeans as corn. When we talk about demand, the big catalyst, I think, this year has been ethanol usage and processing of corn for ethanol. With the high gas prices that we're seeing across the country, demand has improved quite a bit. Last couple of weeks have been some of the strongest we've actually had in history as far as producing ethanol. So good basis there for demand for corn, but it's just kind of lacking in soybeans. So right now, crush has been weak, but there is signs that crush is going to start picking up as we go through the winter months.
Well, Brian, you mentioned the ethanol demand has been phenomenal. USDA raised corn demand for ethanol 50 million bushels on this last report. You mentioned the ability of farmers to hold and to store grain this season. Do you think the ethanol producers are going to be driving the basis bids here as we go throughout the winter?
Yeah, that's what we're expecting is ethanol producers going to lead the basis higher. There's also been good demand from the cattle feeder, hog producers, turkey. All these productions are increasing through this next year into 2022. So there'll be a lot of proteins on the market, and they all have to be fed with corn. And so there's a very strong demand base. Our exports have slowed considerably compared to a year ago for both corn, soybeans, and then if you include wheat as well, our exports are real minimal, the slowest in the last 30 years for wheat. But wheat has its own fundamentals that it's trading off of, and we're looking at ethanol production, I think, continuing to remain strong as gas prices really have no indication or no signs of backing off anytime soon.
Well, and you mentioned the wheat market. A lot happened in soybeans. We'll talk about that in just a little bit. But on the wheat side, there's a pretty compelling supply and demand portrait developing in that market, isn't there, Brian?
Yeah, exactly. We had such a crop loss last year across, a little bit in the winter wheat plains areas, but most of the crop loss occurred in the spring wheat belt. And of course, in Montana and parts of Dakotas, they not only grow spring wheat there, they do grow winter wheat as well. And so that crop was affected. Now, we primarily export our winter wheat contracts, our hard red and our soft red wheat. So we've seen a slowdown in our export markets, but domestic demand for the hard milling wheat that's grown primarily in Minneapolis, it's red hot this year, and we expect to see the prices move firmer and higher basis levels as well as futures throughout the winter months into the spring timeframe as producers remain tight-fisted with that crop. Slow selling is probably going to be the norm this year as farmers want to experience those higher prices, and quite frankly, holding on into the spring and the summer has been a really good marketing strategy for corn, soybeans, and wheat. Over the last 5 years, we've seen a lot of price appreciation in the second quarters of the marketing year over the last, as I said, 4 to 5 years.
Yeah, that is true. We'll talk about soybeans when we return with Brian Hoops from Midwest Market Solutions. This portion of This Week in Agribusiness is brought to you by AgriGold, your seed ally in the field, with unparalleled options that perform on your farm. Learn more at agrigold.com. And we're back talking markets with Brian Hoops of Midwest Market Solutions. Brian, the soybean market had an interesting trading day on Tuesday when the supply and demand was released from USDA. We saw them cut the yield and soybeans jumped phenomenally. What happened on Tuesday with the release of the report?
Yeah, I think the big thing that happened was actually going into the report, Mike. We had sold off sharply going into that report, anticipating an increase in soybean yields, an increase in ending stocks. Some of the estimates for ending stock increases were up to the 450 to 500 million bushel range, and that would be comparable to 320 just last month. But the USDA kind of threw us another curveball and lowered yields and did not increase ending stocks as much as expected. They decreased exports, which is pretty much justified because of our slow pace. But with the small yield reduction, the balance sheet revisions were pretty minor, only a 20 million bushel increase in ending stocks. And soybeans have really fallen going into this report, testing long-term weekly support, and that's where we bounced off of, is that surprise to the trade that had been expecting one thing and received another, gave us a sharp rally on some short covering. And I don't know that this is a start of a bull market. The fundamentals suggest not, because of slow exports and big crop that we have. Plus, you have South American supplies coming on board. So, the soybean market, I think, would probably be the weak link of the grains. Look at wheat. That's probably the most bullish market. Corn would be the next in line. And then right now, soybeans just don't have the fundamentals to really participate in a bull market, other than that short covering we saw on the crop report day.
With that being the case, Brian, soybeans being the third worst potential performer here in the grain complex, should farmers be getting those beans unloaded now, or is there opportunity in waiting until the spring?
The opportunity has come in the spring the last several years. So if you're able to store it on your own and hold on to that product into the summer months, that's probably your best marketing opportunity. Maybe some basis scenarios or even South American weather production has an issue. Right now, crop sizes are being increased because they're off to a good start. So we're kind of discounting some of this news already. You never know what that growing season is going to produce. But if you're in a situation where you're paying elevator storage on this product, I think it's a totally different ballgame then. Then you don't want to pay that storage, plus have the downside risk. I think you're better off turning it into cash, re-owning it on paper, either through futures or option strategies.
All right, Brian, the other news we had this week, Labor Department said we're seeing the highest rate of inflation since the early 1990s, 6% year over year. Are we going to see that inflation move its way into the cattle complex, do you think?
That's my fear, is the economy right now, I would say, is just a stagnant economy, not a growing one at this point in time. And then you have inflation that's rampant throughout the entire country. I think you're going to see something that could potentially be real negative for this cattle complex. Right now it may be short-term bullish for the grain markets. We talk about inflation, higher prices of energy, fertilizer, expenses of chemicals and seed. It should be bullish, especially for like new crop corn that relies on those inputs. But for the cattle market, that's my biggest fear, is even though supplies are getting tight, that if we see inflation run rampant, and we're talking about higher gas prices, and home heating bills this winter could be 50% or more expensive than a year ago, all this is a drain on the consumer's pocketbook, and that could lead to less consumer demand for beef, for steaks at the retail level. Restaurants could really pay the price here throughout this next year of 2022, unless inflation starts to come down real quickly.
All right, a lot of things to keep an eye on here as the year moves on. Brian Hoops, the president of Midwest Market Solutions, thanks for taking the time to talk to us this week.
My pleasure. Good talking with you.
Chad Colby's look at agriculture technology comes your way next, brought to you by the IBM Watson Decision Platform, combining AI with Internet of Things data to help agribusiness increase yields, improve quality, and drive sustainability.
With Halloween in the rearview mirror, a lot of retail stores are changing their decorations over to the holidays. For Chad Colby, Christmas might have come a little bit early with the release of a new drone that he got his hands on and he's excited to tell us about.
We've had another interesting year testing drone technology. One of the highlights is certainly those two Quanix drones you see right there, as we figured out how to fly big acres. But on the floorboard of my truck, you can see a couple other systems. One of the systems you've seen before, that's in the smaller case. That's the drone the size and weight of a Sprite can. And that's that little DJI Mini 2. Great little system for under $800. But the drone I want to talk about in detail this week is the Mavic 3. Thanks to the guys at Flying Ag, they got me a system actually right after the launch, and I had a chance this past week to look it over a little bit and put a couple flights on it. Now, certainly the highlight is the sensor. It's a Hasselblad 20 megapixel sensor with 12.8 stops of dynamic range, and basically a focal length of about 24 millimeters. That looks really good. But you can see here in the case, those batteries look a little bit different and a lot bigger than the ones in the past. Now, I don't have official data yet. They're claiming an over 40-minute flight time, and that is unheard of. But I certainly believe the numbers are probably pretty close based on the few flights I had. The one other thing they did with this system, like the smaller mini drone, the controller's similar. And actually the operation of it is as well. You can see me clipping in the smartphone. I'm going to use that to see the camera view. But look at what they've done. I'm going to start up the controller, and when you plug the cord in, the app that operates the drone will automatically start. And friends, that's a big deal. It makes that user experience very easy. You can see me here with my oldest daughter, Bristol. The drone's actually looking back at us, and it works great. The optics also allow it to have really active collision avoidance. Now, DJI has raised that bar again, and the optical sensing also has the ability to bypass the object like you see here. That's something we've never had before. Before, when it detected the object, it just stopped. Now, for me personally, I'm definitely most interested in the data. And the data is going to come from that sensor using systems like Drone Deploy. And I can't wait to check it out. But this drone, we're going to be talking about it for a while. For This Week in Agribusiness, I'm Chad Colby.
Thank you, Chad. It's incredible to me how quickly that drone technology has advanced since those things have worked their way into mainstream usage. Appreciate that update. And stick around. Later on in the program, Max will bring us the third installment of his conversation with grower Will Cox in our Plant Smart, Grow Smart series.
Welcome back to this weekend's edition of This Week in Agribusiness. Well, just ahead of the coming week is the annual meeting of the National Association of Farm Broadcasting. And the association's executive director, Tom Brand, joins us this weekend. Hey, what's the state of affairs in farm broadcasting in the United States these days? How are your members doing, Tom?
You know, we've got solid membership numbers with the National Association of Farm Broadcasting. I think there was one thing that stayed consistent throughout COVID, and that was the coverage of agriculture in rural areas as well as urban areas across the country. As we gear up for our convention next week in Kansas City, our registration is right on par with where we were the last time we met in person back in 2019. So we're excited about that, especially as we talk to industry colleagues that have said, expect to be down 15 to as much as 30%. So we're thrilled that people are still going to be a part of our convention.
The association has long met in Kansas City, and there was a time, of course, when the meeting coincided with the FFA convention. You were there in Indianapolis a few days ago. That was exciting, being back in person at that event, wasn't it?
It really was. And you know, when National FFA had announced earlier in the summer that they're going to be back in person, I think they're estimating a crowd of around 40, maybe 45,000 attendees with members and guests that were going to be there. Whenever I got into Indianapolis, they'd already cleared 53,000. And by the time the walk-in registrations were complete, they had over 60,000 that showed up at this year's meeting. The energy level is exactly what you expect from National FFA. Those blue jackets, corduroy jackets, making a big splash in town, and a lot of fun to be around the energy of those students as they gathered in Lucas Oil Field.
You're one of those adult volunteers who comes every year to the convention. I understand there are more than 200 of you who show up, who plan your schedule around the FFA convention when it's held.
You know, it is all hands on deck, as you can imagine, for a group that size. And my experience with National FFA goes back, of course, to my time in high school, but also being in the newsroom. As a broadcast intern, a student at the University of Missouri, I got a chance to work behind the scenes. That was 32 years ago, Max. I spent a couple of years as an intern. I became a farm broadcaster. I've come back and helped coordinate those student interns ever since. So An exciting time for me and a great way to connect to agriculture communication students. I had 3 outstanding interns this year. Utah State, Iowa State, and University of Wisconsin River Falls were where my 3 gals came in from.
Well, it's a testament and a reminder to the lifelong passion that many have after having been in or around the FFA. Back to your meeting coming up in just a few days here now. There'll be a lot of newsmakers there. In fact, you have an event where you bring together people from various agriculture associations and companies, and there's always news made at the NAFB annual meeting.
We have several newsmakers sessions that are scheduled for our meeting on Wednesday. In fact, I think 4 or 5 different ones, anything from carbon markets to the agriculture workforce to talking about sustainability and also looking at protein capacities here in the United States. We'll have a discussion about the Farm Bill. And then our largest day is actually on Thursday. That's when we do an event called Trade Talk. And this is a chance for agriculture companies and organizations and associations to have farm broadcasters come around and do interviews with them.
I need to talk with you about the McRib sandwich. You are, in my opinion, one of the foremost non-company experts on the McRib that is back now for what, the 40th season at McDonald's restaurants, right?
You bet. A product that came out of the University of Nebraska, made its debut in Kansas City. That tells you where the home of barbecue is if McDonald's did the test marketing here. And so celebrating a 40th anniversary of the McRib, I love this sandwich. I think it goes back to being a pork producer kid growing up on the farm. My sister had been National Pork Queen in 1977 and then was working for the Missouri pork producers. So there was all sorts of ties to that sandwich, and I have really enjoyed the McRib, probably more so than anyone else in the United States, admittedly.
It has a cult-like following. I'm not alleging that you're a cult member there, Tom, but there's this enthusiastic core with a website following the McRib every year and tracking locations. And I must admit, the other day, maybe influenced by you, I did buy a McRib sandwich. I found on the locator one nearby. I said to my wife, hey, there's a McRib near here. Let's go track it down. And I found the similar characteristics. I remember when it came out 40 years ago, I referred to it as sloppy and floppy. It was difficult to one hand, and you needed a bunch of napkins. And the kid at the McDonald's the other day when I pulled through handed me a fistful of napkins and said, sir, do you need more?
I've had similar experiences. In fact, I've got a grading scale for the McRib sandwich. In my mind, it's the perfect sandwich. So every McRib starts at a 10, and then I deduct points. And my deduction of points comes whether the bun is fresh, the meat is cold. I look at pickle distribution. I look at how the onions are on there. If there's too much sauce on the side of the box, that's a pretty large deduction in my mind. And then if it drips sauce, or if it slips out of the bun, then that really takes it down on the brand McRib scale. I've had a lot of fun with that.
You're tough on them. You know, I'm not sure it ever measured up to the expectations of the pork industry. They thought it would be on the menu maybe the year round, but when you consider the fact it's been out there for 4 decades, maybe it has been a success in its own right, huh?
You know, I would like to think so. And like any campaign that you see from restaurants that are promoting, something special, I think McDonald's recognizes we can get a bigger splash by doing this a limited time of the year and keep that cult-like following that comes along with it.
Thanks much, Tom. We appreciate your assessment of the McRib and a look ahead toward the NAFB meeting as well. Tom Brand from the National Association of Farm Broadcasting. More coming up here on This Week in Agribusiness. This Week in Agribusiness, serving America's most essential industry, is brought to you by Firestone. You never farm alone.
Welcome back to This Week in Agribusiness. We appreciate you taking the time to join us. We've been working with BASF on the Plan Smart, Grow Smart series, and Max has another installment of that conversation, this time from North Carolina.
Mike, we really enjoyed visiting with Will Cox a few weeks ago, the young farmer who farms north of Charlotte, North Carolina, out west of Raleigh, North Carolina, and he shared with me how he has indeed learned from the generations on the farm ahead of him. Quite often I'll hear from a young farmer, well, Dad had a very significant impact, or Granddad played a major role in my life. Sometimes there's an agriculture advisor. To share a little bit about that. Who's really moved you?
So definitely Daddy and Grandpa, they've always been there for me, helped me out whenever I needed it, and I've helped them out. It takes all three of us to be able to make this thing work. The only way you're going to be able to make it is surround yourself with people that know more than you do, so you can learn off of them, and then push each other to continue to learn, and just always having that team there. If you need a question, day or night, they're there to answer it. If you're in a bind, they'll do what they need to do to get you product if that's what you need.
Let's talk about your relationship with BASF. How did you get started working with them, and specifically from the fungicide standpoint, how have you worked with BASF?
Yeah, so Alex came this earlier in the year, around the winter months, and wanted to know if we'd be interested in doing a trial. Showed me trials all over the whole country, and they saw advantage to applying, Veltima. So I said, yeah, I'm willing to try it. Let's see what it's got. So we took a 40-acre field, did 20 acres right through the middle, treated, and then the rest was untreated, of course, and walked it, saw a lot of plant difference. A lot of the greenery in the treated was still there even when the other was starting to dry down. Pulled some ears, Alex pulled some ears, saw some difference in kernel counts, ear size, and just kernel size overall. The ears is definitely bigger where the treated was. We don't know yield data yet. We haven't harvested the plots yet, but what we saw in season with applying it was very significant.
Was it interesting watching the progression of the crop as it advanced, and did that allow you to make a comparison too?
Yeah, it was. We just, we knew where we applied it at, and we walked out there and definitely saw some difference throughout the year.
Do you think the yield data ultimately will guide decisions for you in the future?
Yeah, for sure. Because you can always, usually if you see a healthier crop, yeah, it's, it's going to make more bushels, but you've got to look at how many bushels to make sure it had a well enough return on investment. You don't want to break even, So the yield data is what really shows us, is it worth it or not? And I think it's going to be.
This is one of the best corn crops in a while in North Carolina, isn't it?
Yeah, for sure. This is probably the best in all of our history of farming. We're averaging way better than we usually do. It's always good to see data, but it's good to see data on your land, in your area, close to home, and you get to apply it yourself so you can see it work.
One of those charge-ahead producers you really enjoy visiting with and learning from to see what they're bringing along. You can see more on the website, plansmartgrowsmart.com. Greg Solier now brings us his farm weather forecast for the week ahead, presented by Pivot Bio Proven 40. Predictable, productive, weatherproof. Turn to a better nitrogen. Turn to Pivot Bio Proven 40. Learn more at pivotbio.com.
And now it's time to check in on the weather. Greg Solier joins us. And Greg, looking out at the Pacific Northwest, any systems of size coming through this next week?
Well, compared to the past couple of weeks, no. A fairly quiet weather pattern, normal weather pattern, no large-scale storms. That large upper circulation and feature that was way out in the Gulf of Alaska that was rotating systems in across the Northwest has weakened considerably. Not that there won't be any precip, but it'll be largely focused cascades on to the west here and through coastal areas as we move on to the early part of the week. Fairly mild environs briefly into Big Sky Country. Boy, the wind behind that big upper storm over the lakes region last week blew pretty good, 50 to 60 mile per hour winds, but it's a dry weather pattern there and fairly comfortable for this November calendar date. We'll get this weather system to drop into the central Rockies, shift to the north and northeast, and at least marginally cold air follows in for livestock operations across Big Sky. A little rain snow system here of no significance. A drop off in temperatures. Again, we're back to high pressure as opposed to the next in a string of these storms like we had here the past couple of weeks. So again, quiet weather expected across northern California, the Pacific Northwest. Temperatures just a few degrees shy of seasonal expectations. A southern reflection of that system into the Pacific Northwest is right here with maybe early in the week a stray shower north of Napa. Quiet high pressure in the southwestern part of the country. Cotton harvest making good progress through California as well as Arizona. And it's a mild weather pattern across the Plain States, central and southern areas areas, those drought areas still into play over areas of Nebraska, Kansas, Oklahoma on southward. Some semblance of a front, couple of rain, snow showers, central Rockies, maybe a stray shower into the central and southern plains. That's it. Push of some cooler, windy weather across the valleys of California. Again, a fairly quiet weather picture over the southwestern part of the country too, Mike, as the week wears on.
Well, across the central part of the country, Greg, farmers are still working to get that harvest out. Are there going to be good working days this next week?
Better, but again, slower drying paces. Yeah, the moisture came into play, the wind and the snow as well. And some folks as far south as the central Corn Belt have seen already their first light snow of the season, trace amounts if you will. But note the warm front. It's this half hatched area of red circles. That is milder air, downslope winds off the Rockies as well. So watch it with some high wind issues, especially across parts of the Dakotas. But a nice weather pattern for drying and firming and maybe hopefully putting a wrap on harvest operations. We do get another cold front and a wedge of cold air, light moisture amounts, but nonetheless some delays mid to late week west to east out of the plains of the western Corn Belt. Still late in the week, opportunities for field work in the eastern Corn Belt. There is that warm front and a push of drier, warmer air out of the southwestern mountains into the central and southern plain states. Pretty quiet weather picture across the Delta as well. Lots of opportunity for outdoor work and the last of harvest operations. No rain though for the drought areas of the central and southern plains. That'll be scattered across the Gulf Coast. Still plenty of opportunity to put a wrap on soybean, peanut and cotton harvest from the Delta and east later into the week.
Looking even farther east, Greg, what's your crystal ball show?
A moderation in temperatures off that almost late November feel. And yeah, even a touch of snow has been evident. That'll still linger itself into the northeast New England. Colder air into the mid-Atlantic region. The chill in the eastern Corn Belt replaced by warmth west of the Mississippi. That warm front will move right on through. A better feel to outdoor endeavors. We'll get another reinforcing cold front. Not the degree of cold we had here last week, but a couple of rain snow showers generally focused into the upper Midwest, Great Lakes region, the middle and late portions of the week. Southeastern part of the country after what's been a wet late summer and fall. You'll like this weather map here early in the week. A little change with the exception of a couple of showers breaking out Tennessee Valley back through eastern Texas the second half of the week. Delta region 2.
Greg Solier is back with his extended farm weather forecast for the country, presented by Pivot BioProven 40. Predictable, productive, weatherproof. Turn to a better nitrogen. Turn to Pivot BioProven 40. Learn more at pivotbio.com.
Well, we're talking weather with Greg Solier. And Greg, looking out to next week, who do you see getting the rainfall and who's going to miss it?
I think by and large areas through the central and southern plains missed out. What moisture comes on down will be scattered much lighter and faster moving and really focused late in the week over the eastern Corn Belt. So there should be better opportunities, although evaporation, dry down, moisture reduction and firming of soils will be a little bit more sluggish. No real cold air in sight to freeze up those grounds. So you'll have to deal with ruts out there certainly at some point. A little quarter to half inch here through the upper sections of the Plain States region. Here's the average rain snow line. This is not necessarily going to get all this accumulating snow, but that's where freezing will come into play with perhaps some of the moisture for the Great Lakes region in the form of a little bit of wet snow late in the week. Perhaps some local half to 1 inch in this part of the country with rainfall into the quarter to a half inch range for the northeast of New England. Not much going on this week in Northern California, the Pacific Northwest here in the key drought areas of the southwest and southern plains. Little or none expected for this week, Mike.
Well, Greg, the week after, of course, is Thanksgiving. Folks are going to be traveling. What's your forecast show? I
think in pretty good order with temperatures expected to be about normal here in this part of the country, a bit below average over this part. The warmth over the southwestern part of the country. The flow pattern is generally west-northwest to east-southeast, and that usually means a pretty quiet weather picture with the exception of systems into the Pacific Northwest, southern Canadian Prairie, the northeast of New England. Fairly good travel environs as we see it right here across the heartland. A little leftover moisture from some remnant tropical features, would you believe, down through the Pacific for the Rio Grande and parts of the desert southwest. Normal precip down through Florida.
As the calendar flips into December, Greg, what do you expect to see?
Anything but cold air in mind. A few degrees below average here relative to the time of year. Look at the warmth here across the heartland. Slightly below average across the valleys of California. Temperatures about normal in the southeastern part of the country. We welcome a meteorological winter December 1st. It's a a bookkeeping thing for us here in the weather business. Anyway, the Pacific Northwest, that's good news. Wet weather down through Texas and still some opportunity, plenty of it, depending on ground conditions to put a wrap on harvest and field work from the plains into the Corn Belt. A couple of clipper systems and a dash of snow for the Northeast and New England.
Greg, the week of December 6th through the 12th, does that warmth stick around?
It does, yeah. It's a La Nina year. Believe me, the other boot and or hoof is going to drop here. But for now, no real Arctic air in sight. Temperatures above average. That's good on the heating bill. For the plains, the Corn Belt, Northeast of New England, a bit cooler than average over Florida, the southeastern part of the country, and the Pacific Northwest. The moisture pattern out across the west. Good news here. Gulf Coast, still plenty of opportunity to put a wrap on field work across the heartland later in the month.
Next on This Week in Agribusiness, it's Max's Tractor Shed, spotlighting another great American tractor.
Now about that auger tractor. I've heard from several of you that there's a connection to Granddad. I'll talk about it in Max's Tractor Shed, brought to you by Store Lock Tool Cabinets. If you've shopped around, you know they are not created equal. Many of them are flimsy. They wobble around all over the place. That is not the case with a Store Lock. Check out their variety at storelock.com. Well, some of the old auger tractors that are being used this fall aren't very brawny, to be sure, but they're handling the task, and in many instances, there's a connection to a previous generation. Take, for example, this tractor that Melvin Zenner has in Wisconsin. He loves the John Deere 2020 that he has with its power takeoff hooked up to the auger. That tractor was bought new 55 years ago by Melvin's grandfather. He shared with me that he, his brother, and their dad before them all learned to drive on the seat of that 2020. Now then, in Missouri, Austin Bronestein has this Super C his grandfather bought. And while that farm all is almost 70 years old, the family connection is much more recent. Austin told me his grandpa bought that Super C just year before last. And Austin was with his grandfather that day. When they got home, Grandpa said, "Austin, it's yours." And you can see Austin is not afraid to power it up and use it to help put away the harvest. A couple of old auger tractors, one in Wisconsin and one in Missouri, thanks to Grandpa. Well, Mark Stock has a full lineup coming in the week ahead. Let's check in with him now at Big Iron Auctions.
Max, we've got 1,008 items selling on a November 17th sale on BigIron.com. Pioneer Supply Company is retiring out of Inman, Kansas. They've got a lot of items, 131 items selling. Their headliner, a 2018 Ford F-250 XLT Super Duty 4x4 crew cab pickup, only 33,900 miles. They've got a lot of extra items. Plus, we've got a 2018 Mahindra 8100 Series 4-wheel drive compact utility tractor selling in Bloomsburg, Pennsylvania for Mahindra USA. We've got a John Deere 4940 self-propelled sprayer selling out of Lexington, Nebraska for Country Partners. There's also a John Deere 9870 STS combine selling in Hale, Missouri for Randy Daniels. Check out the 2002 Case IH Titan floater with a new liter L3020 stainless steel box selling for Kent McGinnis out of Nebraska City, Nebraska. Plus, we've got a John Deere 6170M mechanical front tractor, a 2015 model selling out of Brunel, Kansas for RS Angus. Also selling out of Findlay, Ohio is a 2006 Kobelco excavator, a 1997 Case 721B wheel loader also selling for Helms & Son Excavating. As you can see, Max, this good quality equipment keeps coming, and it's selling with no reserves on the BigIron.com sale November the 17th.
The FFA Chapter Tribute is sponsored by Nationwide, the #1 farm insurer in the country. To register your FFA chapter, go to nationwidesupportsffa.com. That's nationwidesupportsffa.com. Nationwide. We stand for you.
This Week in Agribusiness is proud to continue our salute to the FFA, and this week we're joined by one of the national officers. Josiah Cruikshank is the Western Region Vice President for the National FFA Officer Team. Josiah, as the year gets underway, what are you most excited about looking towards the future?
There is a lot to be excited about this coming year. one of the things that's most exciting is my 5 teammates and I are going to be able to visit all the state conventions in the nation. And that is going to be a really fun time. Each of us will visit 8 to 9 state conventions, and to see members gathered back is so encouraging. Being at National Convention, we had over 60,000 people registered for our National Convention event this year, which is so cool to see that FFA is back after a really hard year, I think, for us all. And it's going to be really cool to see what states are able to do more locally, and how we can engage with students through workshops and keynote addresses in that setting. So state convention tour is going to be a lot of fun. We're really excited for FFA week coming up. We're just really excited to get to interact with members in person, no matter what that format looks like, I think.
And that interaction, that excitement that FFA builds is so crucial to keeping it fun for everybody who joins. Josiah, what was it that prompted you to join FFA in the first place?
Yeah, my FFA journey starts before my time. I come from a family that was pretty involved with FFA. Both of my grandfathers were agriculture instructors. And at the 1996 Oregon FFA State Convention, the state president's name was Scott Cruikshank. He was my dad. He was reading off the names of the next officers being elected. And Chicago Bulls music was playing, and the goal was that he would welcome them on the stage, hug them, say congratulations, and send them backstage. But when the state reporter was elected, she ran on the stage, he hugged her, and he messed up his words because he thought she was pretty attractive. He said, "I love you." And that's kind of how my parents met. And so they started dating, they got married, they had me later. So when I was going into high school, they were like, "You should try out this thing. It's the reason I exist," I guess you could say. And I found my place in FFA pretty quickly. Really appreciate the premier leadership, personal growth, and career success that I've experienced in this organization, and just so passionate about providing that to all 735,000 students across the country.
That is quite a legacy of FFA in the family. Josiah Cruikshank, thanks for talking to us this week.
Thank you for having me.
Now, Samuelson Says. Insight and commentary from Orion Samuelson.
On Samuelson Says this week, I want to repeat much of what I said a week ago because of the reaction I got to the subject from farmers, ranchers, and food producers. Stress and its high level of stress because markets and weather, and now this year, shortages and higher prices for many of the inputs that you're going to need for next year. The folks at Southern Illinois University put together a sheet on the subject, and let me repeat that sheet. Number 1, we all need someone we can talk to. So here's the number: 1-833-FARM, FARM, SOS, free, confidential, 24/7. That means around the clock. And the article went on to say someone is always here to listen, anytime, anywhere. We know the struggles of farming and are here to help. So if you are a farm owner or a farm family, we know more about how stress can impact your health and safety. And here are 3 things you should know. Quote, number 1, chronic stress is hazardous to your health. Number 2, chronic stress is a growing problem. Number 3, reach out for help if you are feeling overworked. 3 good points to remember. Our thanks to the folks at Southern Illinois University. And as far as you're concerned, do what you can at whatever place you can to reduce your level of stress. Be safe. Be well. My thoughts on Samuelson Says.
Earlier this week, I had the opportunity to travel to Billings, Montana to work with the Montana Farm Bureau. And there was a lot of enthusiasm for agriculture, but there was a lot of frustration about the lack of rainfall and the drought that they've been suffering. Greg Solier is here at the desk with me. Greg, is there any relief in sight for those northern plains?
Don't think so, at least here early on into the wintertime season. Matter of fact, let's take a recap of that winter outlook that we talked about a couple of weeks ago. And maybe at some point some recharge, but it'll come in the form of melting snow probably later in the wintertime season. There's the early winter perspective. The cold air locked up basically through the Hudson Valley sections of the northern Great Lakes region. Warmth over the western and southern reaches of the country. Note that jet stream in west-northwest to east-southeast. So it's the Pacific Northwest that appears to get moisture recharge, maybe with time. Big sky through the Dakotas, the Canadian Prairie, Great Lakes region into the northeast to New England. So that's the way early winter should go from our perspective. Midwinter time, note the cold air becomes a little more dislodged, encompassing big sky, the northern plains, Great Lakes areas, much of the Corn Belt. That bigger area below average, much below average, expands through the upper lakes region. Warmth across the desert southwest. In a typical La Nina setup, we do not anticipate significant moisture recharge and drought improvement over the southwest, but hopefully that'll come in the form of snow. We'll worry about it this spring, again across Montana, the northern plains, much of the northern and eastern Corn Belt, and just accentuate the cold. It drops a little farther south and west into the heartland here for late winter time. The warmth over the southern parts of the country and the troughs are over the west and the eastern parts of the country. So it's a stormy late winter and probably an extended winter season for the Pacific Northwest, much of the northern and eastern Corn Belt, all the way down to Dixie.
All right. Well, thank you, Greg. We always appreciate your insight. That La Nina mildness might start to leave us, it looks like.
That's the way it looks.
All right. Well, thank you so much. And thank you to all the veterans who have tuned in. November 11th, of course, we celebrated Veterans Day. And those of us here at This Week in Agribusiness, thank you who've taken the time to serve. We certainly appreciate it. And for all of you, please tune in next week. We look forward to seeing you here for This Week in Agribusiness.
Closed captioning for This Week in Agribusiness is brought to you by Kubota. Shape your world. This Week in Agribusiness is brought to you by Firestone. You never farm alone. This Week in Agribusiness is produced by Omax Communications in association with 22 Creative Group. We invite you to visit us online at agbizweek.com.